Welcome to the Infinite Surface podcast. Today we welcome back Brian Booth Craig, and for the first time we have on sculptor Emil Alzamora. In this episode, we'll discuss working from life with two figurative artists that have very different processes. For Brian, we'll discuss the ins and outs of what it means to work from a model and the impact it has on his process and product. And in the case of Emil, what it means to learn and work without the model. And in bonus material, we wander way off topic where Giacometti and art critic Roberta Smith catch some strays. But before we start, remember to like and subscribe, share with your friends, and without further ado, Working from Life with Emil Alzamora and Brian Booth Craig. Hi, Brian. Welcome again.
Thanks, Jesse. Happy to be here. Good to see you.
And Emil, welcome for the first time.
Thank you. Great to be here, Jesse. Hi, Brian.
All right. So we're here talking about working from life. And maybe we'll start with Brian. I wonder, Brian, I know that working from life, from a live model is pretty important to your process. But before we talk specifically about how it is that you use it and how it is that you think about it, how do you think about working from life, or maybe more broadly from observation? How do you think of that kind of philosophically in terms of art education, developing an art practice? How do you approach it or think about it?
Well, I think observation is the foundation of all art experiences, but what that means is different for every artist. So in other words, I don't think that somebody who does work that is non-representational isn't observing the world, right? They're obviously observing the world, but they're gathering different bits of information for their employment later on. As far as what I do, obviously I'm working from the figure or from the live model observationally to gather information, but I don't think that makes me any different from somebody who maybe would be observing, say they're working in a classical tradition, right? So they want to make work that, I don't know why you necessarily want to do this, but say you want to work like a Roman sculptor or a Greek sculptor, you're still observing something. You're observing a tradition, you're observing a paradigm that pre-exists what you're doing. Or if you're working in a purely non-representational way, you're still observing things that come from that tradition of thought, right? So it is a foundational aspect of art making, right? That there's an observational component to anything that we do. We gather information, we reorient it, and we synthesize it with other concepts and ideas and approaches to thought through making. So I think of it in that broader context. I think that's how I view when we say working from life. We're obviously talking about working from a live subject, but philosophically, I don't view it as a completely separate aspect of what an artist does in general, right? It's just a different set of information that is being gathered to be deployed for another artistic purpose from somebody who's observing something else. So writers observe, musicians observe what other musicians have done, poets observe the world in both internal and external. So there are lots of kinds of observation. So I think it all comes down to like understanding what your artistic intentions are and how much of observing life is required in order to explore the line of inquiry that you're interested in. That's how I see it.
Let me ask you a question about that, because let's say working from the model, right? Or even working from a still life or something like that, whether you're aiming in a direction of representation or not, it requires quite a bit of setup. And it requires, especially if you're working with a live model, it's costly. It requires the participation of another person. You have to make an appointment. There's a lot that goes into it, and you have to be ready to perform in that moment, which is an entirely different way of approaching an art process. And the visual information coming to you is, I don't know if interrupted is the right word, but it's completely occupied by what you're looking at in front of you, which is different than like constructing from imagination or invention or trying to synthesize previous observations. So I feel like I agree with you, of course, that everybody's kind of synthesizing observations in the world around them. But I feel like working from life does occupy a special territory. It's not so generic where it's like, okay, we're all doing the same thing. It does preoccupy the artist in a way, and singularly focus on the subject in front of it, in the same way that like someone who's writing but working from interview text is totally sort of bound to that interview in a way that somebody who's just inventing dialogue wouldn't be. And so, you know, like a writer is a good example where it's like you could go to a coffee shop and try to overhear conversations and jot down interesting information and then go synthesize that into character dialogue later. You know, that's one way of observing the world, but it's a totally another thing to say, like, I'm going to interview Brian, I'm going to take down this text, and then I'm going to work directly from that to create a character that's based on Brian. You know, like that's a completely different mind frame. So when it comes to something like that, do you feel like this is essential for certain kinds of arts, or is it something that is that adds an essential component to the creation process?
Yeah, I think it does. But again, I think it's up an artist really needs to be cognizant of the nature of that experience and how it fits what they're doing. So obviously it's a sliding scale. In other words, or a spectrum of nothing is pure observation. Like in other words, even a live model and working from the live model is oftentimes seen as a form of trying to mimetically replicate what is in front of them, which of course is never possible. That's not what's happening. It's actually not what's happening at all. What you're doing is you're fitting it into a construct. You're fitting your observations into a construct, but it's a different form of information gathering. So I think, yes, I think it's different, but I don't necessarily think that it's different in terms of its operation as an artist from other kinds of observation. It's just that I think people have these assumptions about working from life that are incorrect, which is that it's about replicating. It's the idea of replicating life that's in front of you. I mean, I think you should probably get into cloning, genetic cloning if you want to do that. But but I do think you're right. I think there is something unique to it. We can get into the depths of that. I'd be kind of curious to hear what Emil has to say about the same question, because I think I could go off on like 10 tangents right now, but I kind of want to hold back a little bit, just because I think it's such a deep subject. I think it's a good like foundational place to begin, and then the particularities of working from life and using a live model and why it's so different from other kinds of observation. I think we can get into that like as we drill down a little deeper.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting dialogue and discussion to have, especially for myself, who I don't think I've ever sat with a live model with sculpting. I did, I think, a life drawing class when I was 11 or 12 with my mom, and people were really surprised with like that 12-year-old could do the lines and all this kind of stuff. And so that was kind of rewarding and exciting. And then in college, I did a couple of actually just one life drawing class, which I didn't like at all because they tried to make it avant-garde. And they like painted the models, and it was just very rarely was it just straightforward drawing from life. And even when it was, I wasn't really that, it didn't strike any chords in me that resonated. I was just almost disinterested, which was kind of surprising to me because I love human anatomy. I'm obsessed with it. And maybe I wasn't into the models. Maybe I just wasn't, I don't know. I didn't like being around people in the process. I think that's also part of it. Drawing for me has always been kind of a solitary thing and almost a solution to being alone and being bored. What do? Well, I know what I can do. I can draw. And I have this thing I really want to figure out. And that's, how do I draw a person that looks and feels like a person? And I erased holes in countless sketch pads trying to get a bicep right. And I would just over and over from as long as I can remember, and holding a pencil as a toddler, basically, was obsessed with either storytelling or human anatomy and some sort of weird combination of the two. When I left college, and the last 3 years, I don't think I took any life drawing classes. It was more like a 101 class you had to take as a student. drawing from life or sculpting from life, I think, can be a valuable reference, especially like origin and insertion for scapulas and latissimus and like these more nuanced muscle groups that you don't see every day because you can't necessarily see your own back. I have a comprehensive enough to kind of wing it most of the time. Occasionally, I'll take a photo in a certain position or something like that, just to reference it. And that's where the academic, meticulous sort of technical aspect comes in. And it can be useful to be able to observe from an actual, physical person, and almost as a helpful compensatory way that where I didn't hone it as a youth in my erasing through pages. There's certain parts of the body I'm just not quite as familiar with. So occasionally I'll take a snapshot, and it's usually the upper back. And so, I mean, it would never seem like a solution to me to find someone that I could have. I wouldn't need to reference, because it's not really what I'm after. I'm not trying to get something from the experience of working with someone or to capture a sort of essence of their portrait or of their persona or that specific person. It's more of a generic reference sort of material.
So does that, is that to say that having a model would almost be a distraction, because the kind of like, I don't know, the feeling or the need for some kind of portraiture, whether that's a portrait of the upper back or not, that would kind of bring you away from the purpose of the artwork, if the model were there, that there's some obligation?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. And I one of the things I said earlier is just this idea of being alone. And I don't work with assistants. It's only me in the studio. Occasionally my wife will help with mold making or sanding or something like that. But for the most part, it's just me in the studio. And that it's almost like a necessity to have that headspace and that time to just kind of explore and experiment. And even managing a single person in that time is a distraction. So and then to like have to deal with, I guess, all of the nuances of kind of communicating the pose or the getting to know the model or paying them or arranging, all that kind of stuff I think it would kind of drive me nuts. But yeah, and as far as like when I sculpt a figure, sometimes I'll wing it just with metal and armature and start with plaster. In recent years, it's been kind of a collage type thing. I'll have existing arms or hands and I'll start putting them together. And that's almost like drawing in space, because you have these pre-sculpted sections that just kind of fall into place in a gestural sort of way. So that's getting into the energy and the kind of the gesture of the weight and the emotional kind of presence that you can find within the structure and the composition of the body. And I'm also really not interested in identity, as in like specific people. For me, it's like any figure that I sculpt could be anyone. It could be anyone from anywhere on the planet. And I like for them to have that kind of ambiguous, non-specific sort of presence that anyone can project their own self onto it in a way. So that universality is really appealing to me, which is sort of the opposite of the specificness of working from, say, a particular model, especially, and even faces. I'm like, occasionally we'll sculpt a face that has eyelids or lips, but even that, I'm almost like, nah,
too much.
I'm not
Get rid of it.
Yeah, it's too many. It is. It's like it's too specific. I feel like I'm on this quest to find something that's below the surface and on the interior. That's kind of, I guess, sums up my take on. It's a great reference from time to time, but not an essential part of what motivates me or inspires me to make art.
Yeah, and it's interesting about you because there's a teacher part of me. I've been teaching for so long now that I feel like I can't have like a normal art conversation without the teacher part of me kicking in. And one of the things that you have to deal with when you're teaching, especially like really early young artists, is this concept that they have where they're like, well, I want this drawing or I want this sculpture to be like anyone at all. And that moves a young artist towards genericism, right? Like being like super generic and being a bit uninteresting sometimes. And I think what's really kind of fascinating, what always strikes me about your sculptures is that the gesture of them is so expressive. And the proportions of them are often just off, or sometimes very obviously off, but in that way they're not generic at all. So they have this kind of like hyper specificity to them in how they're broken up, or how the posture makes itself known. And there's so much like kind of psychological resonance to that, and the materiality of it. It's so specific in that way, and I think it's so interesting how you tone down the portraiture, like the kind of like details of eye shapes and things like that. It's such a nice balance to kind of deal with that lack of portraiture in a way. Like I feel sometimes in your sculptures, like it's almost like a denial, where it's like you can't get to know, you can't get to see. And I like that in paintings and drawings sometimes, where artists will like kind of obscure the portrait in a way, and it's a lovely kind of frustration, right? Because we have this like natural inclination to like, oh, I want to see the full face. I want to know who this person is. And to have that be balanced with a kind of almost like sanding down, like we're veiling. I think that's a really beautiful thing. Anyway, well, all right. That's just a little observation praise for you, Emil. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. No, I like it. No, I'll take it.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, and I guess to circle back a little bit, it's you mentioned materiality, and I think that in some ways is my sitter. That when I discover a new combination of materials, or a new process that reveals some new characteristic about what it will do, or can do, or won't do, that's in a way like having, not to anthropomorphize material, but it's like having a conversation. What can you get away with? What is it willing to do? What are the unexpected results from trying X, Y, or Z? In a way, it is a dialogue, it's a conversation, it's a back and forth. And sometimes it can be really frustrating, and you just fail over and over. And other times you'll stumble onto something that's a real reveal and kind of fascinating. I happen to have this weird little head here that he's this very strange casting that I just kind of, I've been wanting to do it for a while, but I do slip casting. So I cast the original head, which is somewhat lifelike. It actually has a hint of eyes and lips and ears. And so I have this plaster mold that I poured the slip into, and then I emptied the slip. And I realized this particular mix of slip is very thick and kind of goopy, so it doesn't empty very evenly. And I thought, wow, that's interesting in there. Let me let that dry. And I did this maybe a year ago, and I never got to doing the experiment, but I wanted to let it dry a little bit and then pour cement into it, and then open it and chip the clay off and see what that interior of the slip looked like. And that's basically the inside of a slip cast. So it's 2 layers in from the surface.
Right.
And so these are the kinds of, I guess in a way, it's almost like having a presence in the room while I'm sculpting. Is this materiality that might or might not cooperate.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Well, let me ask you before we move back to Brian, because I think this is a interesting kind of way to frame the conversation, because I think one of the things about working from life is that not that there's only 2 aspects to it, but in a way you could divide it up into 2 aspects and say, well, there's a tradition of let's say, quote unquote, the muse, right? Working from a model and having that model inspire you in a certain way, and then having the work be produced from the inspiration of that reference. Emil was sort of putting it as like a reference, right? So the muse or the inspiration is one way for us to think about working from life. But there's also the educational aspect, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, Emil, but I wonder if you could go into it a little bit more. Like, there's a tradition, especially installed into art schools at this point, which is like, we're going to work and train from the model. And whether that's, as you described it in your school, doing kind of wacky avant-garde things with painting the model and then responding to unusual visuals, or if it's just straight up like, let's try to kind of mimetically, as Brian put it, like do what it is that we see in this new material. So in terms of the educational aspect, in terms of getting the forms, you talked a little bit about like, how do you get that bicep right? How do you get it to, and you're taking a photo or whatever. So how did you learn, how did you, Emil, like kind of get to the point where you felt comfortable enough without training in that way, or did you want to at that time, when you were sort of formulating a method, want to train more like that and didn't have access to it, or what was your thought there?
Yeah, no, I think from very early on, it was very much about seeing in 3 dimensions. And I think I was very into comic books as a young kid, and then early teenage years, I wanted to draw comic books. And a new part of comic books was being able to see almost cinematically and in the round and in every direction. So I would always try to draw from memory any position in any angle with any, so it's this almost acrobatic kind of recall of what the body looked like from different angles in space and how the anatomy worked. And it was just countless hours of filling up gobs of sketchbooks with trial and error from memory. It was almost like a fun puzzle, a challenge to try to recall. And when I would look at things, I would sort of record them in my mind almost as a reference and try to recall that image while I'm drawing. And I still do that to this day. And like I said, I can count on my hand which sculptures I actually had to reference something in the last 20 years or so. And it was this most recent one with the arms forward. That one posed a lot of challenges because it's not only that part of the body, but it's the main part of the sculpture. And he's in this crouch position with the arms forward. I thought, oh, you know what? I'm not going to wing this one. I'm going to take a few reference photos. So that happens upon occasion. But I just really like the kind of the recall component and the emotional kind of, I guess it's like reaching. And David Hockney, I think, wrote this great book about process, and some people use very mechanical lenses to record shapes onto canvas or paper, and you can tell when something is almost like mechanically transferred or recorded, as opposed to the eye that's trying to reach to try to find that. And I think, to Brian's point, he's not mimicking, he's using his eye to translate what he's seeing. And I think it's just varying degrees of that. For me, I'm not actually having a person present or any of that, but it's still this process of, you're not necessarily measuring or using a pantograph machine where you have a grid and you have the sticks, because there are very mechanical ways of doing things. But I think some of the magic happens when you let go of the mechanics and trust this intuitive flow that may or may not take place. If that answers the question, I think.
I believe it does. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
Brian,
okay.
how do you respond to that? Because I think a lot of your teaching experience, whether it was at the Lime Academy before when you taught there, or more recently at the Romart residencies, a lot of that is wrapped up in exposing your students to drawing from the model, sculpting from the model. And if I'm not wrong, almost all of your sculptures are worked from life. Is that correct, Brian? Or
well, they're all okay. So yeah, there's a lot in there.
sorry,
they're not all. Yeah. I mean, I think people would be surprised how little I actually work from life. In fact, I've always wanted to do this experiment where I poll people and which ones use the model the most and which ones use the model the least. I've done work with models 1 session, 3 hours, and finished the figure. The rest of the figure from imagination and memory. And I've had other ones where I spend 10 days with the model. It really varies. But what's interesting to me about what Emil was saying about the act of recording the form in your brain. When I first started using the figure in my work when I was a student, I did a very similar experiment. Every night I would lay in bed, I would try to imagine like a form in my head, see if I could rotate it in my brain and remember it, like see how closely I could record that memory. And so I did something very similar, but that's the mechanical aspect of memorizing form, or the ability to replicate it from memory or synthesize within imagination, is different from working from life, in my mind, my way of doing it. Okay. There are some people who work a lot from life in this because or from photographs, because they want to get a certain kind of accuracy in what they do in terms of but that has to do with their intentions, which have to do with a certain kind of visual effect that they're trying to achieve in the work, right? What I mean by that is that their commitment to observation has to do with trying to extract every bit of surface detail that they can, whether that's in a drawing or painting or sculpture. But that's not what I do. I'm actually the reason I like working from life is I like the experience of having all of my preconceptions upset. It's the opposite, right? So I can make up a figure. I mean, I do it all the time. I can draw a figure from memory, from imagination. I could sculpt one from imagination. But of course a pattern would start to emerge if I did that, right? That's just the nature of doing those things. Now you can slowly shift those patterns, and I think what Emil was describing there in his process is exactly how you do it, which is that you have to have some sort of force to push you off your pattern, whether that's a material or a process or a tool or whatever that might be, or another source of information, whether it's a comic book or a movie or whatever it might be. But for me, it's working from life. So every human body is different, and so whenever I encounter a new model, and I like to use new models all the time. I don't like to repeat too often with models. I like to continually have new people in the studio because it forces me to think about what I assume. Now, the more important aspect of why I work from models is because I like unlike what Emil was saying, there's a specificity to individual personalities that I'm curious about. And what I want to do is I want to create a situation for the viewer whereby the personality that was present with me in the studio is somehow captured in the material, and then emanates out of that material in vis-a-vis the viewer's experience. And that's why it's not essential for me to have a model in the studio for 10 days in a row to capture. Sometimes I capture it, like I get the idea right away. It's just a gesture that they perform or an aspect of their personality that immediately emerges. And I'm like, okay, that's it. That's all I needed. I got it. I can finish the rest of it from imagination, from my memory or imagination. Well, actually, and imagination. But sometimes it takes time for me to capture an aspect of who they are. So it's not, there's no specific goal in terms of the use of the model that has to do with fidelity to their form in space, but it's more about the trying to capture an experience that I have with a human being in their live presence, and then seeing where that leads me. It's a very open-ended process I use. That's the other thing, is that I don't typically, when I'm using models, this is like I'd say 95% of the time, I don't really know what my what I'm going to be making. I don't have a pose. I don't have an idea. Just like they get in there and they do something, and then it was sudden. It's like I go down a rabbit hole. I suddenly see a gesture, and it denotes something in my mind, and then suddenly I just follow that. But ultimately, it's about having that living presence. That's the force of their personality as it emanates out of them, and trying to capture that in some. It's almost like magic, and it's like I'm trying to do a magic trick on myself. As far as the educational part of it, Jesse, the hard part about answering that question is that I don't know what everybody's motivations are for doing it, right? I don't know what their motivations are for wanting to learn a particular observational technique that I use. That's not really ultimately up to me. In fact, I always say it when I teach classes or workshops. I tell them, look, I don't have my way of teaching, and Jesse, you know this being around me. My way of teaching is quite philosophical. Actually, it's not procedural, as in, okay, here's how you make a rib cage, and then here's how you make a pelvis, and then if you put those together, you'll have a, you know what I mean? It's not it's not something that's diagrammatic. I'm really interested in the way in which observation happens in the brain, and how you find clues for the emergent compositional. I think of it as emergent rather than convergent, right? In other words, I'm not taking principles into it. I'm sort of extracting principles out of the experience. Sometimes it's like there's a suggestive quality that emerges from the experience. That's how I approach it with students. And but I'm very clear in telling them that my approach has everything to do with my artistic intentions. And so it's up to them to try to figure out whether that approach what parts of that can be adapted to their own artistic intentions. And sometimes they don't really know what their artistic intentions are yet. They don't really have that formulated. They're just, they see that I have a capability of doing something, and that they want to find out what it is that I'm doing to get the results I'm getting. But so the level of sophistication in utilizing those techniques varies widely within the students that I interact with. But I just work under the assumption with students that they have an imperative in wanting to take a class with me that has validity, whatever that might be. I mean, even if all they want to do is like, I want to learn to sculpt a figure. I just want to know what it's like to sculpt a human body. That's totally valid. That's their own, who am I to judge what their artistic intentions are? But I'm very, very clear with students that ultimately you have to start thinking about what your interest is artistically, and what is going to best serve you, whether it's in terms of process, material, tools, all of these things. And so for me, I found that observation became essential because I really wanted to, like I said, I wanted the viewer to have an experience that there's something almost uncanny and animist about their interaction with this little being, right? But of course that could all shift in the future. And I very, very rarely work from photos, almost never work from photos. I'm actually encountering a project right now that is going to require me working for photos, which is going to be quite a new experience for me, and
a new disruption.
Shift. Yeah. New disruption. Yeah. So I'm both a little frightened by it, but also excited, because I'm saying, okay, well, I'm just going to embrace it. I'm just going to embrace that this is a new challenge and a new way of thinking about making something. So, but I'm like Emil, and see, this is an interesting thing too. When Emil is saying he likes that solitude, I think in a way the model is a good release valve for me, because I tend to be hermetic. I'm like here with my cats and my dog, and my daughters live with their mother. So I'm alone, and I get a little weird probably if I just alone all the time. So
I hear that. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. So in a way, the model is a good way to sort of pull me out of myself, get me out of my own head, make me interact in a way that's. And here's the other thing is that for me, this working from life, it took a while for me to do it, actually, to hire models, and because I was very uncomfortable. Like, it made me very uncomfortable. But I thought, actually, that's the whole point of it. Like, is that the discomfort was actually, when I realized that, I was like, oh no, that is actually part of the value of it for me personally, not necessarily for everybody else. But and once now I'm very comfortable with that. But I still recognize that it's it's a weird thing to do. I mean, it's especially when you're dealing with a nude model, because you have somebody that's vulnerably standing there, exposed, even if they're clothed. Just clothed. If you're doing a portrait, like I had a model one time teaching a class who really almost had a nervous breakdown after a week or 5 days of sitting in front of students, because she was like, I can't take it. Everybody's just staring at me. Like, all these people, like 6 people staring at me. And I was like, I totally got it. Yeah, I totally got it. I was like, yeah, that is an unusual activity. It's not an everyday activity. And I think so I treat it that way. I treat it as this unique experience that you can have with a person, and I try to get something out of that. And I don't want to fetishize it. I want to capture the essence of that experience and then take it from there, which is why I don't work from life as much as people imagine. Maybe 30 times a year total. That's about it. But again, it really varies. It depends on what I'm doing. Sometimes I just really get into trying to there's a part of them that's hard to capture, and it takes me a little longer, and then sometimes it just happens quickly. So
what's interesting is I hear that you've referred to it almost as like a disruption, or something that takes you outside of yourself, or like pushes your comfort zone, which I think is really important for the artistic practice, is to introduce an element of chaos where we are not in complete control, or we have to kind of let go of the reins of being the dictator, and hashing out in a technical way exactly what it is that we think we're doing. So
yeah,
I guess
I 100% agree with that.
At its core, it's almost like we're talking about the same thing. Is like, whether it's me experimenting with different materials, and what does the material say, and how does that influence what I make with it? It's a very consistent look and feel to your work. What you're saying, what I'm hearing from you, is that the process of obtaining it has a lot of unpredictability built into it. And I would probably argue more than mine because I don't work around people. So it's just me in there kind of hashing it out. I mean, you should see my wife calls me booby trap, because I just set things up to fail all the time, like on the edge of something, or things, it could just collapse at any minute. And I think that's me intentionally setting up the unexpected so that something beyond my own decision making can take over. And the end result is almost, from a professional perspective, too varied. Too chaotic, a little too inconsistent. In some ways, my process is I'm more of a control freak, because I'm wanting to control all the elements, whereas you inviting someone into your space, and on the surface you'd think that, oh, Brian's more of a control freak, because look how meticulously he crafts his work, and they're so finely sculpted, with such care to the attention to all the little components. But you're introducing this element that is, in some ways, like, I won't go there, because I'm not willing to have that element of chaos in the studio. I mean, because it adds this whole other mental dimension that I'm just not willing to like encounter.
Well, there's an interesting thing that you're bringing up, which is like, I wanted to ask this question of both of you, which is like, you're both talking about your processes. They're similar in some ways, different in other ways. But there's always a question. I don't mean to make it too much of a question of commodification, but if you think of
it's real.
Just for, sorry,
it's real. Yeah, it's real.
Yeah. Well, exactly, right. And so if you think just for a moment, if you think of sculpture as like a product, and you think of, or if you think of it as an interactive piece where you could have that concept where it's like, well, no artwork exists until a viewer has seen it and interpreted it. One of the things that both of you are kind of observing about your processes is that maybe the people that look at it don't quite take from it what it is that went into making it, or they might have a misunderstanding about how much you're working from observation, and so I wonder, A, where does that come from? And then B, like to Brian's point about his upcoming project working from photographs, it's like, if you discovered, Brian, that you could get the same result or the same, same unpredictability from any other process of shuffling photographs, or if you discovered that eating a different breakfast each morning got you in the same mind frame and you could just invent figures, is it important still? Is it still important to work from life at all? And of course, as educators, we run into this problem all the time, which is just a problem of pragmatism, right? It's like, how much money do you have? How much time? How much, as Emil's kind of putting it, how much mental capacity do you have to like manage a person? If you could forego all that, and if the viewer is not really perceiving the kind of work from life anyway, is it still important?
Well, okay, that's a great question, because there's almost no way to answer that question. Because it is an impossible question to answer, right? Because yeah, I mean, theoretically, I would say, yeah, it's not important. Theoretically, yeah, what difference would it make if the end result was the same? But I would posit that that's not what really happens. In other words, like just to use Emil's example, if he like I wouldn't, the way I know, I kind of I understand some of the chaos he's talking about, because he shows it sometimes on his Instagram, right? He's sort of like, and I've been in the studio, so I've seen like that, the work environment, right? But if you saw the work, you wouldn't necessarily know that chaos that he's describing. It's inherent in the work, but in a way that isn't obvious to the viewer, right? But it's, I guess what I would say is that process is essential to the result, but it's not necessarily visible in the work in an obvious manner. But I would posit that it's essential to getting to the end result. So I don't know that those things can be separated from each other entirely. I think that's not really, theoretically, yes, I agree with you, but practically speaking, I'm not so sure it works that way. The way to find out, of course, is to do what you said and just try bringing the model in, take some photographs, and then see what happens. But I think I would end up in a different place. I would end up exploring a totally different philosophical aspect of in the process of doing so. I guess here's another way of putting it, which is it's slightly different, which is that whatever points of tension you can find in the process, those are the things you want to lean into, right? Like, in other words, like you can become competent at things and make it smooth for yourself and easy, right? You can make it so that you have total control over all aspects of your process, right? Now you've removed all tension from the experience, but I don't think that's the way art is generally made. I think art is generally made from exploring all the points of tension that occur along the way. And for me, I realized pretty early on that I had a facility for modeling form, right? It came very natural to me. But as soon as I bring a model in, it's like, oh shit, this is like, I get nervous. I still to this day get nervous. I don't mean nervous in the sense that like, oh no, there's a naked man in my studio. Like, that doesn't make me nervous, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, it's like, okay, I am now tasked with trying to get something out of this. And it's really, it makes me a little anxious, but I like that. I like that it makes me anxious. I like that it forces me to really be sharp and in the moment. Like, I have to be totally in the moment. And it really focuses my mind in a way, because I also like to be efficient when I do it. I'm not like people who would work like 300 hours with a model on something. I'm totally opposite of like a Ewan Uglo, right? Or Lucian Freud, who for them, it was all about that constant questioning of their observations. That was their point of tension. It was constantly, what, that's wrong. It would be constantly like shifting things minutely, right? Over long periods of time. For me, it's really about, I think part of this comes just out of the economics of what I do. You know, I have a very short time where I can capture something. And when I realized that was getting things out of me that I wasn't capable of getting out of myself through any other means, I leaned into it. So
Perfect. Yeah,
I
that's
understand.
perfect. Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, Jesse, that theoretically, yeah, if it results the same, fine. But I don't think I would have ended up where I am in what I'm trying to do and explore if I hadn't put myself in that situation. Right. So yeah, I don't know if that's an answerable question.
I think
it's
you did a good job. Yeah, you did a good job with that. It makes
You
sense.
have thoughts there, Emil?
No, I think you answered it beautifully. And that part of a good art education is to be told that if you have a space that's familiar and comfortable, shatter it and push past it, because that is basically the dead end. That's where things stop. So you're obligated to somehow push and find whatever it is, whether it's, in your case, the tension and the kind of high pressure, high stakes of working with a model pushed you to do things that you may not have thought to do, or even knew you would do or could do. Everyone has to find that sort of that edge, because the whole point of art, I think, is to kind of explore the edges of not just our lives, but where we perceive the collective human life to be at this moment in time. And I think, I mean, one of the thoughts I had earlier is in terms of the commodification, I lean heavily into the idea that art is a service, and I provide a service, and it has a function, and the function is to stimulate people's lives and nourish them and nurture their psyche or their psychological, philosophical questions, that kind of thing. It's a little support system. And so I humble myself into thinking that I'm providing a service, and I don't mind saying that it's worth something and attaching a value to it. And in fact, it's part of the metabolism of being able to function in the studio, is this very natural kind of rhythm of making and then selling, and then making and then selling. And to your point earlier, Brian, it's just, I just make stuff and I hope I sell it. That's almost 99% of what happens in the studio. And even the commissions, it's almost like, hey, I have an idea for something in the yard. What would you make for it? And so I'll come up with 4 or 5 different sketches or drawings that could kind of be made into a sculpture. And then that's sort of my commission, is that I'll make some drawings and they'll respond to some of them and that sort of thing. Yeah, ultimately we kind of have to find those murky areas to challenge ourselves to be doing our job, I think, effectively and in a way that I think people respond to. Because if we're just doing what we know, then it's I don't know, it's kind of it's not edgy. It's not pushing.
Well,
it.
let me ask a question there. Sorry, Brian.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me say something real quick. Just one thing. I think, maybe another way of saying is that maybe we shouldn't say that we're working from life, but we're working with life. Like there's a totally different thing. Like what Emil's describing is you're not the whole symphony playing. You're not doing the whole thing. You're working with it. You're working with the experience rather than you're not the source of it. You're working with the thing that you're experiencing in life. So you're working with life, not from life. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I like that.
No,
I had that thought when you were talking.
Yeah, that's good. I want to ask maybe this is slightly different topic, but I think it's relevant in a way. A lot of the conversation that we've had has talked about kind of interruptions. How do you interrupt? Brian, a few answers back, you mentioned, well, if I just invented, if I just worked from my imagination, then a pattern would emerge, and I want to interrupt that pattern, right? And in my constant quest to understand the world better through basketball, I'll make a sort of basketball analogy. I can never tell still if people like this about me or not, where it's like everything has to be a basketball analogy. But let's take, for instance, like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? Like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is super famous for his hook shot, right? And in some ways, Kareem was, it may be a bit boring to watch sometimes because it was just like ball, bounce, bounce, hook shot. But there's kind of a magic to the mastery in that. And there's always different contexts. There's always different defenders. There's always different dynamics. But in the sports world, there's a lot of examples of things like this. Like, for instance, like maybe like gymnastics or ice skating, where there's certain performative maneuvers that you would be expected to be able to do. And landing a triple barrel lunge or something like that. I'm not too familiar with these kind of sports, but this kind of like performative way, or even if let's take it one step a little bit into the basketball thing again and say like, there's these things that they do called match cuts, and they'll take, for instance, like one of the easiest examples to do that is with someone like Michael Jordan and somebody like Kobe Bryant, where Michael Jordan they'll show a video of Michael Jordan starting a move, and then they'll cut to Kobe Bryant literally finishing that exact same move, and just repeating that over and over. Or they'll put a match cut together of Kobe Bryant just performing this identical footwork, and you're just watching it work over and over and over again, and you're like, wow, that's really mesmerizingly wonderful to kind of watch. And so part of my question is like, how is art special in this, in that where we're looking at someone like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and totally unabashedly being like, that's one of the greatest basketball players ever. That's one of the, blah, blah, blah. Like however you might throw on all of the accolades or acknowledge all of the accolades of what it is that he accomplished. But ultimately that's him creating a kind of rhythm of expectation and an infallibility of like form and consistency. And how is art so specifically special or different than something like that? I know it's not an easy answer or question to answer, but what are your thoughts on that? I guess I'm not sure who I'm asking that to, but either of you can answer.
I do have a thought on that. Emil, do you want to go first? I do have a thought, but I'll hold mine if you have something.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think I like the analogy of sports, but I think one way you have to shift the analogy to make it fit is that when you're talking about sports, you're talking about externally imposed rules, right? You're talking about externally imposed parameters
for
structure in which all of the successful moves are going to be inevitably defined by that, right? So it's kind of what I was saying about things being emergent rather than convergent. Like things have to emerge out of the process. There's like almost an inevitability to these things. So using the basketball or sports reference, it's the reason the patterns emerge is because there's an inevitability to perform those particular activities efficiently and effectively over and over. You have to work within the parameters of the rules and of the sport, right? Now, where art differs is that there are no rules externally opposed. People might think there are lots of people who say there are, but actually the rules are internal. They're internal to the processes of the artist and their artistic intentions. So that's why I always like to say that the rules that create what you're doing have an inevitability to what's going to emerge from it. That's also why I think that Emil actually alluded to this already. In some ways, I want to remove myself from the process. Like I don't want to be in the way of it. I'm more a conduit through which it flows. But it's flowing within the parameters of what I've set up, right? If I change those parameters, then I'm going to be following a different set of rules. And I think there's an inevitability to the way that will emerge, right? From those parameters. So for example, if I shifted my whole process, and this is why getting back to your previous question, this is why I don't think theoretically it's possible to get the same results with a completely different process. I don't think that that's practically how it works, because if I shifted my whole process, I didn't use models, but I was thinking, okay, now I'm going to start doing everything from imagination. But what I'm actually searching for is, what is the pattern that's going to emerge from that? There's going to be an inevitability to it because of all of the things that make up who I am in this point in history and my experiences, and that the process itself is going to have a certain kind of consistency to it. I'll give you an example of this. I say this all the time when I teach students. I can picture a first-time student sculpture right now. I don't care who they are. Like, I've seen the pattern so often. There are certain perceptual and mechanical precepts built into the way that people do things. It's why if you look at children's drawings, it's the same way. They look the same. They all kind of have the same. They have the same pattern to them. The heads are large. They're the biggest one in the family, even though they're the smallest one physically. All these things. There are psychological precedents to the way that the brain is constructed that emerges out of that process, right? So in a certain way, that's what makes art exciting. Like once you start finding yourself going down a path, you don't actually know what's going to happen, and you're trying to find all of the things that are going to come autochthonously from that process that you've started to engage with. It's why it's more of a it's more of a line of inquiry than a series of answers that you're going to provide to the world. Like in a way, it gets back to what Emil said about providing a service. Like in a sense, the service you're providing to people is you're going to be the conduit through which these questions are asked, and have some sort of physical manifestation in the act of making the question. Like you're the one that has been picked for whatever reason to explore that. And it's so that's the service in a sense that you're providing. You're because most people don't have the means through which to do that. So using your analogy, I think it's a good analogy, but I think it has to be shifted slightly, simply because the rules and the parameters are not externally opposed. It's one of the reasons why I don't like to teach in a manner that tells people, here's the right way to make sculpture, here's the wrong way to make sculpture. That's ridiculous. There's no right or wrong way. It's only what's right or wrong for the processes that you're exploring, and it's more about awareness of what's happening in that process and responding to it. And I think that, like you said, like I like the example you gave there, Jesse, actually, of the hook shot, or the what do they call the cuts? The
match cuts, yeah.
Match cuts. Yeah, what I like about that is that what you're describing there is that there is a almost a necessary move that people have to make to perform within those rules efficiently and properly. In the same way that there are certain body types that are going to be better suited to all those activities, right? Look at gymnasts, look at ice skaters, look at swimmers, look at basketball players. Now there are outliers who kind of break those rules. They're the Muggsy Bogues of the world, but there aren't very many of them, right? I mean, they're not going to be as successful as the Michael Jordans. He's like the perfect body for the rules of that sport. So in the same way that you could say biologically, there is an emergence, there's a series of movements and activities that are emergent from within those rules, and the people who master all of that are going to be the best within it. But with art, it's different, because what Emil does, like what Emil's doing, what I'm doing, is we've set for ourselves a series of questions and parameters for working, and we're trying to find part of what art making is exploring what is the best way to see the questions arising out of the material as we go down that path. There's no way you could do a match cut of a meal, because you'd have to have two Emils, right?
Yeah.
Right. It would be redundant, right? But I like the analogy, just shifting the, it's not a court. The court is, each studio and each person's particular place in life and history. So
I have a thought on the so if you take the analogy part out and observe the two different worlds, the athletic world and the art world, there is some potential overlap in that, like a basketball player can discover the hook shot. There's a hook to it. It's almost like a gimmick, or like you've got this thing that you do, that you're the 3-point guy. boom, you got it every time. Boom. You can slam dunk in people's faces. You know, it's almost like, and that works in sports because like the banana kick in soccer, like you master that, you're on fire. And so it's a completely different realm of what is celebrated in that in art, if you have, I mean, well, and here's where it becomes a value judgment too. Like some artists have their version of the banana kick or the hook shot. And some of them do really well at really high levels because they mastered this kind of gimmick. And I think that brings in this whole other discussion about why we seek to disrupt, because we're allergic to the gimmick and we want to run like hell from anything that feels like it's that predictable and it's that surefire success. So in athletics, it makes sense. It seems to it's rewarded and it's celebrated. I don't think you'll get too many athletes that say, well, you know, that works so well, I'm just gonna like not do that anymore because it's too easy. It just
It's
doesn't
been done
happen.
before. Somebody did it
Yeah.
before, so why are you gonna do it?
Yeah. Or I do it too many times, I have to change it up because it's just too effective. Whereas in art, at least for me, it's like if I do something that feels too effective, I'm like, oop, I almost start rebelling against myself. I'm like, oh no, don't
Which
go there.
in the basketball example, that's so odd because that would be like Kareem being like, man, I sure am scoring a lot. I better go step out behind the 3-point line and ruin my career.
And that goes into like personality too, and maybe conditioning within the realm. And I think the art world conditions through education and through especially postmodernism. Totally. I think they kind of encourage you to basically dismantle yourself to the point of minimalist oblivion. And so that was my education anyway. Why do you do the figure? It's been done before. I heard that so many times in art school. And it was very disheartening, but at the same time I didn't care because I just knew I had to do it at a time when nobody was doing it. And so it was a way to, I guess, not follow the trend or the tide. So inherently doing the figure was my way of not succumbing to the trend, which I don't know, like Basquiat was the trend when I was in college in the 90s. Like, oh, everyone's got to paint like Basquiat. He's a genius. It's brilliant. And Basquiat's great. I love his work, but it didn't strike a chord in me to where I changed my whole studio practice. I just appreciated it.
One of the things that's
the opposite.
Let me say, Brian, like one of the things that always strikes me about that, like I heard you say I was doing it when no one was doing it. And I think a lot of us felt the same when we were working figuratively at that time in that education system. But it's not the case that no one was doing it. Like tons of people were doing it. But the overwhelming kind of like dominant narrative was that it wasn't happening. And one of the things that I want to point out, there was an article, Jenny Seville had an exhibition in New York, maybe about 4 years ago or something like this. And Roberta Smith wrote a review of it. And this kind of goes back, reflects a little bit on the skyhook kind of analogy as well, which is like, Roberta Smith doesn't strike me as a Jenny Seville fan. I read a couple of her reviews of Jenny Seville's work, and it's always kind of pretty harsh. And at least in my view, Jenny Seville is one of these people who, quote unquote, has a skyhook, like, can perform a series of inquiries or a series of responses to the human figure that is fairly extraordinary. And I remember one line, I won't be able to quote it perfectly, that Roberta Smith wrote, but it was something like, Jenny Seville is just cutting whole cloth like motifs and ways of working from antiquity. And the point of it was like, and that's so lame. And to kind of extend out the basketball metaphor, I thought it was so odd. This is one of the moments in time where I sort of like conceived this idea of like, wait a minute, there's such a difference in the perception, where basically Roberta Smith was saying like, well, look, we're looking at a basketball player here, that is taking the best of Kareem and the best of Jordan and the best of Kobe and the best of Shaq and putting it all together in this kind of like magical combination of things. And because this has a root in what has been done before, it's not worthwhile. And that's, you know, I mean, it was a completely bizarro take on what Jenny Seville does. And it had this condescension to it where it was like, yeah, like I'll acknowledge that Jenny Seville can slam dunk and has a sweet sky hook, but who gives a shit, right? Like that's so low. And I was really like, to be frank, I was a bit offended by the criticism of it, because while ostensibly I agree with you both, there's a part of me that's defensive of that for exactly that reason, Emil, that you brought up, which was like when we were coming up through school, there was this sense of like, well, you know, like this unnecessary interrogation of figurative work, where of course it's important to interrogate your work. Of course it's important to conceptualize it in a greater framework. Of course it's important to understand why you're doing what you're doing and to not take it for granted and to move into uncharted territory. But when that's not enough still, I mean, I don't think it's so bold to say that Jenny Seville moved figuration into some uncharted territories. You know, maybe it's not a magnificent shift in the history of art, but you know, it's like Jenny Seville's not no one. You know, in the same way that Kobe Bryant is not no one, right? Kobe Bryant is Michael Jordan 100%, but also is not, and there's a value to that, and so that's the kind of that's where the genesis of the comparison came from, where I said, like, well, you know, how is it that Roberta Smith feels so free to look at a Kobe Bryant that's playing in the league and be like, yeah, he's winning championships and he's got all the moves, but who cares? He's just a version of Michael Jordan, and we've already seen that. And it's like nobody feels like that. So I feel like there was kind of a false narrative that was built up around the idea of figuration, where it's like, that concept is so key that you're talking about, Emil, where it's like, you know, don't get too comfortable, don't get especially too gimmicky, right? But there's a complication to it where it's like, well, you know, everybody's gimmicky, right? Like, I mean, is that to say that Jackson Pollock wasn't like just a massive gimmick? Like, you know, it's like, I mean, the works, I'm as big a Jackson Pollock fan as there can be, but it's like, that thing is, I don't know if it's fair to call it a gimmick, but it's like, if you're going to call figuration a gimmick, then you got to call that a gimmick too.
Right. This is really, I love this line, this path, because this is the discussion I get on quite regularly with artist friends of mine. This very thing you're talking about, because oftentimes what we're doing is we're misapplying criteria for things. So this is maybe where the analogy falls apart. Okay, so there's a lot for me to try to organize in my thoughts here, because you really got me thinking down this path here. But okay, let me go back first. Like we can easily dismiss that criticism because everything is derivative. I don't care what the hell you do.
Right.
Like that's the whole nature of art. I mean, to say that you have a connection to other things and that's somehow bad destroys the whole purpose of art. Art is a communal activity over long spans of time. That's what it is. I'm not that important. You know, what I just have a place within this bigger communal activity. That's why art is so valuable and essential to being human, because it's something we do collective. It's something we actually do together, even though we're crazy hermetic people making messes in our studios and booby traps, as Emil said. Right. But the reality is it is communal. That's what we're doing. So I completely reject that kind of criticism of anybody artwork, and I don't think it's an accurate criteria, because getting to your analogy, I think actually what's happening here with this analogy is Emil was using the analogy in a different way that you were using it, but very slight difference. Okay, so the analogy of using the same move over and over, okay, depends on how difficult that move is. So for example, somebody who I don't even like the word a gimmick. To me is something, it's not something that's repeated, it's something that is predictable and easy within its within its execution. Okay, that's a gimmick. A gimmick is something that is not an exploration of a singular activity, but a non-exploration of.
Well, I'll give an
something.
example. So, like Cause with his X'd out eyeballs is a gimmick.
There you go.
I mean,
that's a gimmick. Exactly. That's a gimmick. Exactly.
It's as raw as it gets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So what I would say, one of my favorite analogies or examples for this to use your analogy of somebody repeating a move over and over is Giacometti. He's one of my favorite artists of all time. Okay, because what I like about him is that he wasn't. This is where the analogy breaks down. He wasn't doing the same move over and over and succeeding. He was trying to do a skyhook from the opposite end of the court. He was exploring something that he knew deep down was impossible. What he was trying to do was show the immateriality of the mutable human experience in a fixed form. That's what he was doing. He was attempting to physically display something that wasn't physically displayable, right? That it was a repetition of an action over and over and over, and constantly questioning his observations. I mean, he would work sometimes for hundreds of hours on paintings and drawings or sculptures, like just repeatedly over and over, and then take it down and put it back and take it down and put it back. Now, if you look at that, you could say, well, he didn't move out of his lane. He was in the same damn lane for decades, right? But the reason he was in that same lane is because he was attempting something so difficult that couldn't be done in an easy way. He again, I think that's where the analogy maybe breaks down a little bit. He was trying to do something that was within his own parameters that he created for himself, like his conceptual framework for what he was trying to do. He was trying to talk about an aspect of human experience using a medium that was not totally congruent with that, right? And the only way he could do that was to repeatedly perform this action. Okay, so
well, I went to that show at the Guggenheim with Giacometti, and it went all the way up, and it started out with his early works, and I was really into the early works, but I have to say, 3/4 of the way up, I started feeling like, yep, I wasn't seeing that attempting the impossible. I was seeing something else, and I was seeing
interesting
frustration. I was seeing possible commodification. I was seeing pressures from the marketplace. I was seeing things that weren't as alive and I guess I don't know. It didn't have the same sort of life that some of the earlier, more bizarre pieces had.
Right. Well,
I saw a mind that kind of constricted itself, almost like a rock that gets stuck in a river and digs out those holes, and the little rock is in it for years and years.
And now we've accomplished the goal of the conversation, which is to expose Giacometti as a gimmick fraud. We've done it, guys. We've done it.
But I think
some parts of his work.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're describing is exactly actually, I think your feeling is exactly what he was experiencing. I think he was starting to feel himself getting sucked down a drain, where he just couldn't get himself out of it. He just, that's why I find it so interesting. But again, I mean, we could use lots of examples. He's not the only one. I mean, there are lots of examples of people who the challenge they put before themselves wasn't completely changing their work, but was doing something that they felt like they just couldn't get to the bottom of it, right? They just like Flaubert said that you just write. The only way to write about a subject is to write about it until you can't say anything else, and then you move on. And I don't know that anybody else from the outside can really judge that. It's obviously it's an opinion, and
it's what I seek
Sure.
and look for in my
Right.
what I expect from not just a
Yeah.
work of art, but a collection of works by an artist.
Right.
I think
Right.
Anthony Gormley's another interesting example.
Mhm.
And although he has dozens of assistants and pumps it out like a madman, it's hard to even comprehend his production. But there is a constant sort of scramble and inquiry, especially if you look at the whole entirety of his work.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and it's not that I'm a huge fan of all of it, but I like the spirit that he's questioning the whole artistic process from.
Yeah.
I find his work honestly more engaging than Giacometti, just because I don't know, it stopped for me. Giacometti stopped after a time. I couldn't look at the same thing over and over and over and over. And not that they're the same, but there just wasn't enough for me to chew on. And even Gormley, I'm like, I'm over it, because it's just through the variety of his work, there's this droning kind of process that's the same, which
Yeah.
I don't really like when you have sculpt by numbers. Basically, he's giving assistants these rules and they just make them. So I think I'm very opinionated and judgy about but
Well, I don't.
it's my job to be, because I'm on a quest to find sources of energy that I can draw from and apply to my own creative process. I think that's an endless task as an artist to just keep gleaming, like you say, participating in the conversation throughout history and through what's happening now and what you can imagine might come in the future.
And it's interesting too
I-
with someone like Giacometti, because it's like you can shift from the artwork to the biography of the person with someone like Giacometti, whose biography has been so documented and so explored, and maybe you might even say so exploited, to add a kind of like emotional and almost like compositional element to the artwork. So when you're navigating that show, you know, that biography has to be in mind, that sort of historical context, and the way in which the war and the suffering and all that made its way into the aesthetics, that's present and it's promoted, right?
Sure.
It's like written. And so that's an interesting thing, because in a way, like Gormley's work is different, because like the process is exactly the thing. The aesthetics are put forward beyond the biography, right? So it's not about Gormley, the person who lived a life, and the artistic response. I mean, I guess it has to be that, but the artwork seems to move forward in a different kind of way. Whereas the pattern that evolves in something like Giacometti, it gets you involved in this question of like, well, what kind of person is this that would do such a thing? And it actually, Brian's kind of question of, well, it's like trying to do a sky hook from the opposite end of the court. Like there's a bunch of interesting ways to kind of parse that out, because it's like, in some ways, if you look at, like, let's take that example where Kareem is just nailing his sky hook over and over and over again, and the Lakers are like, keep doing that because we're going to win championships like that. And maybe there was a point where Kareem was like, look, I want to advance the game. I've got a new idea. I want to do something else. And the Lakers were like, nope, keep sky hooking, shut the fuck up. Like, no, thank you. Right. And so maybe there's a moment where he's like, yo, I want to go down to the other end of the court and start sky hooking from there, because that's the future of the game. And the Lakers are like, not interested. That's not basketball. You know, it's impossible. It doesn't even work. And you know, the weird thing about art is, like, you could say, well, it's absurd to want to do that, and that's actually interesting and funny, and there's commentary or there's satire in that. There's a deconstructive quality to the game of basketball in a person like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar going down to the end of the court and suddenly shooting 0% for his skyhooks for the rest of his career.
Sounds like an artist. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
you know,
But
and
let me
go ahead, Brian.
yeah, but let me clarify though, because what I was saying about Giacometti is what I was saying in terms of his exploration. Like Emil said, the early work, like the early work. Well, the early work is the later work. In other words, like what I was saying about him exploring. I'm not just talking about the the famous pieces that we all know. I'm also talking about as soon as he broke from the surrealists, basically from that point on, he was exploring something. And like his friends made fun of him because he started carving these figures out of plaster, and they kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And they're like, the figure is going to disappear. He's like, those early pieces where it's a block of plaster and this little tiny figure carved out, right? Like it just disappearing over time. So I was talking about that whole span. I mean, it's all one piece, different forms of the same idea of exploring. But he had an idea, he had a sort of monomaniacal idea that he was trying to figure out what it meant to observe life, right, as it's moving past you all the time. But so just to clarify that, it's not just the
No, I like that.
That's
just,
really what he was doing.
Yeah, I didn't dive deep enough, I think, to his work.
I mean, he was almost,
I think
the surrealist movement was his early work, and then he kind of broke. But I mean,
I feel like there's more there. With surrealism is almost like it's almost the human mind untethered from convention in a way, and I feel like it got a bad rap because of its sort of no man's land. And I consider some of my work to be heavily leaning in the surrealist, direction, because I feel like there's so much there to unpack over. I think the future of humanity, it really is surreal. And we've deconstructed everything to the point of, well, I mean, minimalism scared the shit out of us. And so we had to like pop out of it. Like, what are we doing? And so we see things like Jeff Koons and Andy Warhol and that kind of stuff. And that's sort of spawned its own genre of art and street art. And like, oh my God. But I think the real questioning is self-reflection. Who are we? What are we? What are we aiming for? What are we trying to figure out about ourselves collectively at this point, after we've sort of categorized and made an encyclopedia out of the entirety of existence. We still have entire spaces to explore, and I think we can no longer explore it with this tidy historical construct that has worked for centuries. So in a way, I feel like his earlier surrealist works, although they're part of a movement, I feel like they were some of the more interesting pieces because it showed more of who he was as a person, rather than this very art conscious, self-conscious exploration of a style or this thing that you're like, that perfect skyhook thing. I felt like it became almost an OCD, not to get into mental disorders, but it didn't feel free or unbridled the way that I feel like creativity can be. And I think that's something I always have a red flag out for, is to see when work has a constraint on it, be it commercial or conceptual, or trying to fit into a contemporary trend, or trying to overtly communicate with the historical lexicon, all that kind of stuff. I'm always searching for evidence of an individual, like a real personality that is exploring things that are, I don't know. I mean, obviously pertaining to the human conversation, and not just art history, but the entirety of human history, but also showing vast amounts of innovation and, I guess, willingness to not make any sense in hopes of revealing something that might portray ourselves accurately. Because it seems like life is getting more and more nonsensical.
I feel like
no, that makes sense.
Henry. I feel like Henry Darger is like a good example here, where even if we go back to Brian's original comment about working from observation, like Henry Darger is a person who was observing was obviously not working from observation, like in any kind of technical sense, wasn't making still lives or anything like that, right? Is like taking magazine clippings and like weird icons of people and violence and creating this very personal, very private, very expansive, but sourced world. And he's someone who, you know, the biography of him and the presentation of the show is so vital to understanding the work. And that way, Emil, of saying like, I really sympathize that, where you're like, well, you know, I feel like I didn't like the Giacometti show, but now I feel like it's my personal responsibility to somehow like it, you know, to like dig a little deeper and like somehow understand it more thoroughly so that you can connect to it at least, or you can profit from being around it in a way. And Henry Darger is such an interesting example of someone who's you know, working like he's an outsider artist almost by definition, right? And or he's probably the definition of an outsider artist. And you know, he's not going to work with any of the typical means, but he is going to explore, as Brian was saying, like a kind of singular topic at a depth to which, you know, I mean, honestly, like very few artists can claim to have dug as deep into a topic as someone like Henry Darger did, even if that topic was like intensely private and intensely personal and only really exposed later, right? Like posthumously, basically. So that's a kind of like interesting for me bridge or maybe artistic moment or art historical moment in time where we're taking someone's exploration of observations completely out of, and of course his work could be identified as surreal, could be identified as fantastic, you know, it could be almost sci-fi in a way, but it's none of those things, right? Because it's like so intensely personally, privately observational. You could almost call his work like plagiaristic, right? Like he's just cutting and pasting and copying over and over and blah blah. But it's none of those things because it's so intensely observed and private. It's kind of an amazing example for me, and interesting, like in relationship to someone like Giacometti, who's you know, didn't have, at least in the most famous works, like very much compositional exploration in a way, was kind of like singularly figurative for a while. And so I don't know, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, getting back to, I mean, this kind of gets back to your original point, which is what I was trying to get at with the Giacometti example. Not so much like the genre is exploring, but just the idea of the repetition of a movement, right? That I don't think the analogy, this is what I was getting back to. I don't think the analogy quite works because, as Emil responded, that in art, you're you know, you're not going to just keep doing the same thing. It's a completely different, you know, the rules of the goal of a game of a sport is to win, and the winning has certain rules that allow you to do so. And so if you find something that works over and over, you're going to keep doing it because that's what makes you win. And that's where I think the analogy doesn't work, because sometimes the repetition it's not the same thing. I don't think like a Henry Darger, repeating the same exploration over and over is the same as a skyhook, because I don't think it's not clear. He's not clear what he's shooting at, right? I mean, that's the thing. It's like, this is where I don't think it's like, I think it breaks down a little bit there because in other words, there's no virtue in just suddenly shooting off and doing lots of different things just to show that you're exploring, you know, like one day you're throwing pottery and the next day you're doing the abstract expressionist painting. Like I'm the real artist because I'm the one exploring lots of things. I don't think that, you know, I don't think that that's what Emil was saying either, by the way. I think that what I was getting at is that the repetition of the action is not because there's a difference between repeating an action because you know it's successful. Like, for example, like a better example would be somebody who wants to paint like Rembrandt and just keeps repainting Rembrandt paintings. I mean, we know, when I say that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, I say that, and this gets back to what Emil is saying. There's a sort of, it's a regurgitation of a formula that can work. And so it becomes predictable. That's what I think that's different from somebody like repeatedly exploring a process or a genre or a subject or whatever it might be, because they don't know if they're hitting the mark. It's more like repeating the same action in the dark. You're not quite sure where it's going. And that gets to what Emil was saying also about the sort of nonsensical aspect of things, that it's when things become, when this is, so getting back to what he was saying about art school and the postmodern education, where you weren't supposed to do the figures, and you're constantly supposed to be just throwing shit at the wall. Well, the opposite of that is an atelier education, where you're just making the same paintings as everybody else. And you're supposed to keep making that same painting. That's what he was talking about. So I think this is where the analogy really, it's a good starting point, but then as all analogies are, they're convergence points, and then you move off in different directions.
Right.
So I think I think in a certain sense, one of the reasons we can recognize all artists is because all artists' work. We see it, we look at a Picasso, we know a Picasso is because they were repeating themselves, but they weren't repeating it they weren't just making the same. Every artist is they're not necessarily making the same thing over and over. They're repeating an action that because they can see that it has more potential. Like it's rather than narrowing, it's widening, right? I think that's the difference, and this is getting back to the original topic, which is working from life. This is kind of what I was saying. I actually like the nonsensical aspect of it. It's like, it doesn't, as an activity, it's like, it's totally batshit crazy. It makes no sense. Like you're gonna, but it can become predictable, because you say, I'm gonna make a sculpture like Rodin. I'm going to repeat, like you see this, whatever it might be, or I'm going to make a sculpture like they teach me in this particular program. It's going to be the same thing. But there are lots of ways to throw things off kilter and do what Emil is saying, where things become slightly nonsensical, and you're in a certain way, as Emil was talking about how the future is so bizarre, and what does it mean to be human in this moment? In a certain way, we're basically asking the same questions they were asking 50,000 years ago, right? Like it's having consciousness and awareness of your existence, and the existential crisis that comes from that is just it's the same thing. We just are given lots of other things to question, right? About a lot of other reasons to question that. And so responding, I totally agree with what Emil's saying, regardless of what genre you pick or tradition you're shooting off from, that has to be a starting point for asking those questions. And if it means repeating the same thing because you just keep digging into it until you get somewhere, and you don't even know if you're getting anywhere.
And that's legitimate. I mean, absolutely. I think it boils down to what your personality is, and are you OCD or are you ADHD?
That's true. That's true. It's really true. That's true. Yeah.
I'm in the ADHD camp, where like if I start doing the same thing, I freak out. So I have to start something completely different or new, it's exciting, and I only hope that my practice is authentic and I'm genuinely interested in what I'm doing, so that my spirit kind of resonates within the works that I make, so that there is a bit of me in everything I do. And that's ultimately what will be the thread or the idiom that resides within the work, without being too self-conscious of it. I think that's the problem with the gimmick, is that people can think that they need to have an identifiable style so that they can build a career, so that they can have success, so they can make the money, so they can keep doing it or become a superstar, or whatever the motivation is. I think ultimately, yes, one has to figure out how to make money at this. And I think I've managed to make that work through sheer volume. I make a lot of work, and I some of it sell. and a lot of it doesn't. I mean, you should see the house. It's jam-packed with work, but that's okay, because I'm having fun doing it and I'm getting away with it. And man, it's super satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting what you said there, because trying to create a style in order to get somewhere is not the same as a style just being a natural result of the fact that you do something, right? Like I recognize your work when I see it. Like if it comes across Instagram, I know immediately that's you, even though it's different. Even it could be something very different, but it's sort of like it's almost, yeah, it's a strange thing. It's a lot of it has to do with familiarity, right?
True,
there's it's almost like your personality is imbued within the whatever like pathways you're going down. It's something about your personality is there. You're not forcing it into it. It's just coming out naturally. That's how I feel when I see artists' work that I like. They don't seem to be. They just seem to be letting it happen, and
right.
yeah, that's always an interesting question to me, is how, what is it that makes a thing recognizable? Like in music, we can get it. Like you hear Mozart, you're like, oh yeah, you can kind of get Mozart, you hear patterns or whatever it might be, but with visual art, like what is it that makes why can we recognize an early Picasso and a late Picasso and see the same personality in there? Right, that could be
well, like you said,
different
familiarity is a big part of that, and biography is another big part of that. Like we know so much about Giacometti, so we know that the surrealist work relates to the more stick figure type work, and part of it is myth building, and I think that's one of the things that you have to do as an artist nowadays, is somehow craft a story or promote this thing about what you're doing, so that people can kind of latch onto it and start to see the pattern. And our friends or people that our colleagues are familiar with the work because they've seen it grow over time, and we've talked about it, and we've seen the slideshow and all that kind of stuff. That's why I think the gimmick is heavily relied upon, is because it's almost it's a really easy kind of way of establishing that kind of presence and familiarity. It's like, wow, that's obviously that, because it looks just like that over and over again.
Right.
And I just find that that's not doing the right service to the art practice, because the point is not to become identifiable or famous or any of those things. The point is to, I don't know, to put on the diving gear and go as deep as possible and see what the hell's down there. And you can only do it. You can only do it in your style, because that's all you have. Those are the parameters you have to accept, because you are you, and that's that.
Yeah. It's funny what you were saying about being ADD and like kind of like jumping all over. It's actually one of the reasons why I get bored really easily. People would be surprised by this. I get bored really easily with things. Like if I want, it's why I like having different models all the time, because it's just it's like I don't want to see this. I get bored really quickly and easily. The worst part for me is like the finishing of things. I just want to move on. I want to move on so quick. I'm so ready to move on sometimes. I've disciplined myself to know that that there are certain things that I have to do. It's the nature of the process.
Absolutely.
Mold making,
oh my God.
casting.
Yeah,
it's like
I'd say 80% of my sorry, let me close that. 80% of my whole time in the studio is like, I'd rather be doing something else, but that's just part of the discipline.
That's the way it goes.
It is.
That's the way
it is. It's especially with sculpture. It's like, oh my God, another mold. Okay.
It's kind of
this
fun.
is the reward.
It's kind of funny. That's why I was like inside. I was laughing because I was like, oh yeah, I totally understand. Like you're saying, like you have to jump all around. But then I'm like, oh yeah, I also know that he has to make his own mold and he does his casting. It's like in a certain way, you need to have those aspects of your process that allow you to just be free from all of that procedural stuff and not have to get into the patterns so much. But
right, it's duality.
We all find it in different we all have to find it in different places. It's interesting, but for me, it is definitely the model experience is what gives me that jolt, that shock of being like, oh, okay, here's a new thing, something
I
new to
bet.
deal
Yeah,
with.
no.
Yeah.
Especially if you
Yeah.
don't have a preconceived, like learning that you don't have an idea of what you want to accomplish before, and just kind of letting the model be this thing that kind of speaks to you. And it's like they're the living material, and they're
Yeah.
shaping
Yeah.
you as much as you're shaping them. So I think in
Absolutely.
the end,
Yeah.
it's an interesting full circle, different approach, kind of.
Yeah.
It's a very informative conversation.
Yeah, very.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to wrap it up before we get into 4,000 more hours as usual. This is just part one of a 67-part series called Why Do We Make Sculpture Again? Why do we do that again?
That's so true.
Well,
Well,
listen,
Jesse, thank you for hosting and for asking all these great questions. It definitely brings a lot to the forefront. So thank you.
Yeah, really, really lovely to have you on, Emil. We'll hope to have you back again. And Brian, as always. But thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Good stuff.
Thanks for having us on.
All right,
Good night,
thanks
Emil.
so
Have a
much.
good day, Jesse. Okay.
Talk
Good
to you
night.
guys
Good
later.
night.
Okay. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you like the conversation and want to hear more, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. Look out for more content coming up, including more episodes of Fat Stacks, more drawing and anatomy demos, and more artist interviews on Infinite Surface Podcast.